Well, let me
Right.
give a little introduction before you get started. I'm Michael Duffy. I'm a member of the All Souls Forum Committee, and we have hosted on an annual basis the mayor of Kansas City to give us the state of the city every year for, I believe, more than 40 years now. So we're glad that Mayor Lucas could help us continue the tradition. Again, Mayor Lucas is mayor of Kansas City and is took the helm at a very momentous time in Kansas City. So he's had a lot on his plate to deal with, and I think a lot of us are very impressed with his record to this point. So, Mayor Lucas, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you all so much for making time to listen to me this Sunday morning. It is an honor. And while this is a slightly different conversation, I always see this as kind of a real way to kick off, if I may use football parlance, the year in policy and in budgeting here in Kansas City. For those of you who know Kansas City, Missouri government, our budget is introduced usually in the second week of February. We're working on the final touches there now, and we will have a number of issues we address, as well as looking at any of the policy items that we're facing, both from Jefferson City and certainly from Washington. More positives from Washington, a set of challenges from Jefferson City, as is the usual, and what we can do to address them. When I became the mayor of Kansas City in 2019, it was an interesting time and one not without its challenges. We were facing an affordable housing crisis that's only been exacerbated over recent years. We faced an endemic of violent crime in Kansas City, something that we continue to confront. But none of us could have imagined actually seeing the public health challenge of the type of which we've had during COVID-19. But COVID isn't just a story of a disease that is spreading rapidly throughout our city, our community, and our country. It is also something that shows the challenges with some of the stark political disputes and the demagogues, I would say, that we have present, not just in our city, throughout our state, and throughout our country. Since I last visited you, I have seen a sense of optimism turn to something that isn't quite as optimistic as it was 1 year ago. When President Biden was inaugurated, we thought in some ways we would see real changes. And it's my view that we have. We've seen, I think, a better rollout on the vaccination policies. We've seen our ability to actually listen to public health without substantial debate from Washington's leadership each and every day. But the polarization and the politics have not ended. Here in Missouri, we deal with an attorney general that, to help himself get elected to the United States Senate, continues to challenge school leaders, health officials who work hard each and every day to keep young people and to keep our communities safe. I regularly talk to superintendents, and nothing is more frustrating than, to me. And I will say this on behalf of some of our superintendents who find themselves in districts where the political climate isn't always hospitable. It takes a lot if you're in, and I'll just name some places, not saying that this is a representative of them. If you're in a Liberty School District, if you're in a Grain Valley, Park Hill, North Kansas City, Lee's Summit, and you're dealing with outbreaks in your school district, school boards that are concerned about the political realities that will face them when their elections come up in April, and you finally say, I can't not act. And so many situations for us have not been profiles in courage, but have, to the contrary, actually been situations where school districts couldn't look the other way, where we had classrooms that were out on quarantine, school bus drivers not able to come in, and teachers who were saying that this continues to be a substantial threat to ourselves and our families. Something the Kansas City government did in response was to make sure that we issued our own mask requirement within the schools themselves. The reason is very simple. We can handle the political challenges. We can fight the fight. We get in fights all the time, and it's something we're fairly used to. While we don't necessarily have Michael Duffy quality lawyers, we have very good ones who are able to pick those battles to make sure that we're defending the health and safety of our city. But that has not let up the Attorney General. And then the Missouri State Treasurer got in the act, threatening to withhold funding and support for schools that have a mask requirement. This, my friends, represents a sense of insanity these days. Just getting people to recognize and to care that this is an important crisis. And a story that I never actually shared early during the pandemic, I believe in the spring of 2020. I was home one day. It was an exhausting time. All types of things were happening. And over at Central High School, off of Linwood in Indiana, a group of kids were playing an unsanctioned football game. It got on the news. They interviewed a mother who lived near Central High School, and they said, "Ma'am, why are you not concerned about COVID-19?" She said, "Well, the president doesn't care, and if the governor doesn't care, why should I?" Even in areas where there isn't political similarity, where the voters are very different, those voices we have at the top make a difference. And that's why we will continue at Kansas City government, myself, city council, our acting health director, and so many more, to make sure that we address this issue with the importance that it deserves, that we try to provide clarity where there is not always clarity, and that we continue to preach the importance of vaccines and being responsible about public health. Despite the fact that in many ways, I think our COVID crisis reflects a failure that folks like my colleague, Dr. Rex Archer, for 20 years had warned people about, how we weren't ready for the next pandemic and how it would disproportionately impact the poorest in our communities. One final point, and I'll move on. The thing that concerns me the most, and I don't regularly watch the Tucker Carlson program or some of these others, but often commentators will sometimes say, well, if you're not elderly or just over 60, and if you're not overweight, then you're likely fine. These items often uttered by people who find themselves in those categories. Never before have I seen so many in our country, well, perhaps it has happened before, but it's unfortunate when you have people utter such lack of care to their peers, their brethren, to themselves. Every other day in the news, we see a story of someone who's a vaccine denialist. Meatloaf, for example, the musical artist, who dies. And so what I encourage everyone to do is to not give up hope in the fact that we can change outcomes by encouraging people to get vaccinated, by allowing for common sense medical interventions, and that much of it can be done through the power of persuasion. Speaking of persuasion, an area that we had ongoing challenges with was in public safety last year. As we know, each and every year of my lifetime, and in many of ours, Kansas City has been in the top 10 most violent cities in the country. Last year, I think we tried to at least say, as a city councilman, as a mayor, that we need to see something different. Unfortunately, with state control of the Kansas City Police Department, it's hard to do it that way. For those who don't know, the Kansas City Board of Police Commissioners are 5 people, 4 of whom were appointed by the governor. Congressman Emmanuel Cleaver once taught me how to speak about people positively, so I think he usually would say, God loves all of them, and I'm sure they're great church members. But in terms of finding ways to work on prevention in our community, looking at diversity in our law enforcement ranks, and trying to be creative and address the crisis of violent crime in our community in a very serious way, the Board of Police Commissioners model is wanting. We're overly defensive of officers that have done wrong. We don't do all that we need to do to make sure that we're making inroads in our community, addressing more communities, having a police chief who's present in the inner city, the urban core each and every day. And we find ourselves continuing to, in our budget discussions, have a fight about how do we make sure that we have enough money for things like spare helicopter engines. Well, we don't have money for a robust social work program, or we don't have money for enough community police officers. In the next budget to be introduced, you'll see many of the discussions that we had last May when the City Council tried to exert at least some portion of control for the people of Kansas City. You'll see us take steps again, and in my opinion, very important steps. Steps like making sure that we have some level of agreement as to what the police department's doing, that we have increased accountability between the city, ultimately its voters, and the Board of Police Commissioners. And that we make sure that where there are new programs and ideas, we aren't just in Kansas City looking the other way. I say this with respect to our law enforcement officers, particularly at the rank and file level. You can blame a mayor, you can blame a police chief, you can blame anyone, I don't care. What we're doing right now is not working. Every year, we should not have 160 or more Kansas Cityans murdered, 500 Kansas Cityans shot. It is an epidemic of epic proportions. In my lifetime, and I've lived 37 years, over 4,500 Kansas Cityans have been murdered. Those are warlike numbers. That does not mention the number of Kansas Cityans who've been wounded by firearms. It doesn't mention the number of Kansas Cityans who are impacted, who are children, who are relatives, who are family, who are schoolmates of so many children, so many people that have faced challenges over the years. I ran committing to make a difference in this area, and I continue to believe that we can. A few lighter topics, because I don't want to make us too sad all day. One thing that I think we've seen real progress in is housing. Now, we're far from perfect in housing, don't get me wrong. There is much we have to do. For years now, we have been able to, I think, leverage success after success year after year. Some years ago, it was the Healthy Homes Ordinance, which brought rental inspections and healthy housing conditions for all renters in Kansas City. That was a vital and important step. The next step for us has been capitalizing, investing in our Housing Trust Fund. Through the American Rescue Plan signed by the President and passed by Congress, we've been able to put in an initial $12.5 million into our Housing Trust Fund, expecting to put another $12.5 million in this year with our ARP funding. So having a total of $25 million, plus funding other sources, including last week, a move by City Council to capture tax revenues coming from the Midtown Costco to invest another $10 million in the Housing Trust Fund over the years ahead. That means the next important step for us isn't actually just having the money, but it's spending it well and it's spending it correctly. We continue to work on ways that we can promulgate good recommendations for how we spend that funding. Our model needs to be cities that have had successes. In Kansas City, funding hasn't always been a challenge. I point you, for example, to the Central City Economic Development Sales Tax, where we do have funding to support inner city development, but for a number of different reasons, including challenges in the development process and our own bureaucratic challenges, we have not got money on the streets in the speed with which we've needed to. I want us to do better with the Housing Trust Fund as we have monetary support for it, and over the year ahead, you can expect it. So I sometimes ask myself, do I remain optimistic about the future direction of Kansas City? The answer is yes. While we know the challenges that we have, I think during my term, and it doesn't relate to me, it relates to the realities of the world, we've had to be real about it. We've had to be real about the fact that we need to enhance our public health infrastructure, that we need to address affordable housing and try to reduce the number of evictions that we see each and every day, and that we have to have a very real conversation about violent crime in our community. And we have to do all of that while making sure that we have a city that welcomes diverse voices of all types. Over this past year, we saw new investments, perhaps once unthought of here in Kansas City, supporting our LGBTQ community, anti-bullying legislation, an LGBTQ commission, and recognition of trans rights, both for those who are employees of our city, but more broadly in Kansas City. You know, sometimes people ask me, is it tough living in Missouri? And the answer is yes. And occasionally, when it's tough in Missouri, I look across the line and I say, I don't think Kansas is much better. But what I think is that we can lead in Kansas City, Missouri. We can lead with the help of some of our suburban peers as well. I don't know how impressed I've been by mayors in Northeast Johnson County of late, Prairie Village, Mission, Marion, who have found ways to make sure that they're realistic about COVID-19, for example, and that they're making sure their communities and all our communities embrace diversity. Those are the sorts of things that we can lead on, and I think we can be a strong voice for people in our entire region. I was in Springfield, Missouri last summer, and I had the chance to visit to a room of roughly 300 people in Springfield, of all places, where they said, thank you for having a voice that says COVID is important. Thank you for saying things don't have to always be the way they will in Missouri. And we have to recognize that as we keep having our voices and we speak loudly, we preach loudly, that we are making a difference. We're making a difference for kids who grew up like me. Just because you've known homelessness, tough neighborhoods, anything under the sun, doesn't mean that your opportunities need to be limited. In recent weeks, we celebrated the Kansas City School District returning to full accreditation. And I know for many of us 20 years ago, we didn't know if it would come back and we didn't know when it would come back. But a lot of folks believed. Teachers kept going to work every day. A school board figured it out and hiring a good superintendent. And I think that's the same story, whether it be crime, housing, or health in Kansas City, that we can all get back to. So I thank you for listening to me now. I look forward to your questions. And I thank you, as always, for keeping this important Kansas City tradition going. Send it back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate that. So the first question comes from Joe Robertson. Joe, go ahead.
Good morning, Mayor. Yeah, thanks for being here. Hey, do you have some like creative ideas or plans toward concerns about unity in the city? Particularly, we seem to have a split between the Northland and south of the river. How are you addressing that going forward?
You know, there has been a very interesting discussion on how do we better unify the city. I know the Kansas City Chiefs are a part of that, and so I hope they just keep playing for a while because that usually makes people happier. But to address it more fully, you know, I have taken an approach that is in some ways unconventional, and that is to recognize that there are voices for, in my opinion, progress in our city, equality in our city, and equity in every part of Kansas City. I am one who does not actually believe that there is a huge fracture between the Northland and those south of the river. I think there is perhaps a fracture between the elected officials there and those south of the river, who, for a number of them, recognize, and I say this with great respect to them, who, Teresa Lohr, for example, has been on city council previously, started serving roughly 30 years ago, and others who I don't know if they actually know some of the Northland voices, for example, that I get a chance to talk to. When I go there, I visit the very diverse North Kansas City School District. I talk to school teachers, nurses, others who say that they are new to the area and want to make sure that their voices are heard. The chair of my redistricting committee, an African American woman by the name of Stephanie Smith, who did an outstanding job, faced substantial questioning about the fact that she's not a real Northlander. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, actually. And so for me, it's actually a story of how do you make sure that you're finding those voices where they are everywhere. And so that's why I actually just try to do it by going everywhere. You know, my Chiefs barbecue bets aren't just for the sake of, you know, being rah-rah about everything. I went to Martin City the other day. I make it to the Northland frequently. I'm always in Midtown, the East Side, et cetera, areas I've known for years. And I think that's one way that we actually make sure we make a difference. We don't actually allow ourselves to just get pulled into that sort of division. There are important voices in every part of Kansas City, but I think I speak for the Northland far more, perhaps, than some of my colleagues who, yes, while they go to the same groups each and every year, and while they're going to the same meetings, and it's been some of the same people around the table, aren't trying to find those new voices at issue. And so that is one step in that direction. I think another step, though, in the right direction is to make sure that we continue to push for more diverse voices, I would actually say, in our business community. For too long, and you know, for too long, actually, I'll say this has been going for 40 years, we will have mayors that speak to you at this forum, and then we'll go to a business forum and sound very different, and everybody at the business forum looks kind of the same. I have appreciated, and my predecessor did some work on this as well, and saying, how can we make sure in Kansas City we are seeing more people from different backgrounds promoted, that we're just at the CEO ranks. I'm not even going to get, you know, desperate and say we need more minority voices, getting women appointed to more CEO positions and leadership positions. That's why I'm proud of my efforts with boards and commissions in Kansas City, where a majority of our appointees are now women, something I think that's important and was long overdue for this city. And so for me, it's about being out there and present. It's about creating opportunities for more. And it's about not actually just letting folks define you. You know, the problem with television news sometimes is they say, all right, who can speak for X or Y part of the city? And they go to the same 2 or 3 people. And those people say, oh, I am so angry. Well, you know what I've learned, because I came out of an East Side council seat, Quinn Lucas did not speak for the whole East Side, couldn't pretend to speak for the whole East Side. And if you thought just having my voice do it was enough, then that's not right. And I think in the same way, it's incumbent upon me as an elected official to make sure that I'm listening to many of those different voices.
Let's take the next question from Craig Walland.
Thank you. We've had in the last couple of years this what I regard irrational housing bubble, where cost of housing has been going up radically. And I wish you could talk more about this housing trust and how do you get from A to B, which is to actually build something. And is there any innovative thinking and work going on, like tiny houses? And is that impacted by not in my backyard?
So a few different things, and I know this relates to one of the questions in the comments granted by Mary Ellen, and so I'll try to answer them both together. In housing, the first thing that Kansas City often misses from a broad-based policy matter is that we don't talk enough about the need to improve our single-family housing stock. The houses that we see all around Kansas City, particularly areas where we need substantial housing improvement in East Kansas City, South Kansas City, Southeast KC, and in the southern part of Clay County. Something that I've actually worked on, and oddly enough, every now and then our junior Senator Josh Hawley actually listens to discussions on it, is how can we make sure that we're actually getting more funding to support not just home rehab, but also opportunities to get more folks into either mortgage arrangements with single family housing or anything under the sun. I do not think that multifamily housing, i.e. apartments alone, will address the situation for us. And I'll get kind of to more on the apartment side in a moment. On the single family housing side, what I hope that we do with our housing trust fund is to make sure that it isn't actually just an incentive set aside sort of thing where we give a developer a few $1,000,000 for putting in a few affordable units, but instead also look to, well, can we help be a gap filler or help support as an underwriter loans to folks that are trying to buy houses so they can stay in older neighborhoods of Kansas City? Can we make it a way, particularly if we have programs that are with folks like Kansas City, Missouri employees, many of whom are vastly underpaid, school teachers and others, where in other cities you've seen very creative programs to get them into stable housing arrangements, and thus we can support the stability of our neighborhoods, but also support their families. There are thousands of employees of the city, school teachers, et cetera, for whom those types of issues and initiatives would work. On the apartment side of things, I think it is a move away from how we saw incentives before. And I say this with great respect to my predecessors. When Mayor Barnes was in office from 1999 to 2007, much of the incentive and development focus was just how do we get people into the city? Leaving the 1980s and 1990s, where cities were largely defined by much of the flight outside of them, there was a goal just to get people downtown and just to get people back to Midtown, the Plaza, et cetera. The challenge is we never really updated our policy. So for too long, to very recent years, we were saying we still just want people here. So if you're building 4 light, 5 light, 10 light, right, that are 20-story buildings, largely for luxury clients and all of that, that's fine because our goal is just to get people back. I think the nature of the world and politics and how young people want to live is actually something that supports the American city. And so what we need to make sure we do is that we have an American city that isn't just built for lawyers or those who work at finance firms or something of that sort, but is more broad-based. And so I think for us, continues to be how do we move our incentive activity out of areas that have traditionally received incentives to more areas that need them? How do you make more individualized incentives? How do you do work like that we've seen in Lycan's neighborhood, for example, in the Northeast, where you're seeing very on the ground help for the single family housing stock? And then our housing trust fund is helping to develop infill development, those blocks where you may have a house that has been torn down, or you may have a challenge in housing. Those are the sorts of ways that I think we really start to address housing. And that's what I want to see the housing trust fund be, beyond just a fund the developers can use as gap fillers on projects.
Mike Hoy, next question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about federal infrastructure funds. What are your priorities?
On infrastructure funds, and this relates to a question also in the comments in the chat forum, there are a few. So the federal infrastructure funds versus let's say our capital improvement sales tax have different roles and goals. I ran for mayor, pledging to fix potholes. You have seen substantial improvement in our road conditions over the last year. They're not where they need to be, but we have quadrupled spending in road resurfacing and repair, sometimes to our chagrin, because there's a lot of construction going on some streets, particularly for those of you who traverse Midtown. We recognize that. We recognize the challenge, but that's our hope that the city's getting better each day. And so I see the federal infrastructure funds not necessarily as your road and sidewalk type things, because Kansas City's working hard to fix them, but instead actually on where do we have opportunity for more transformative type of infrastructure improvement. What does that mean, for example? One of the studies that I'm looking at relates to how we improve the Prospect Avenue corridor parallel to 71 Highway. When we built 71 Highway, we did a lot of work to make sure perhaps that it was beautified, you have the streetlights there, any number of things. But the goal of actually making it so it didn't just cut through dissecting the neighborhood has largely failed over the last several years since it's been open. And so for me, it is what can we do to actually make sure we're not only just improving Prospect, which ends up being kind of an access road for, but also then leveraging some of the infrastructure dollars we have to build certain nodes. 63rd and Prospect is one example. If you ever find yourself there, there's just still a big vacant lot that has been there since I was in middle school. And really, if you go up the street all the way to 47th Street, you run into the same concern. That's one resource priority of mine. There are a number of bridges that find themselves in disrepair as well. That's a hope that I think is key for us to make sure that we're actually addressing that infrastructure. I know Congressman Cleaver has great interest in enhancing our bus system and network. I'm very proud to have been a mayor who launched zero fare transit. And in fact, I was humbled the other day when the mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, gave Kansas City a shout out, right? We're not just cool because of our sports teams, but also some of the work we're doing. And so I think continuing to support and sustain that system is something that's going to be vital for us along the way. And so those are largely, my thoughts on what it is that we need. Looking at that very expensive, I mentioned bridges because they're very expensive to replace and repair. So looking to address that infrastructure, making sure that we're actually looking at how we can re-envision certain highways and opportunities. And I would think being as creative as possible. One thing I'm wanting to do now, and it's a project that's been knocked somewhat for superficiality, but I think it's important. So we are building a new Buck O'Neill Bridge, and we are, pardon me, just got distracted by a message, but we have an old one to deal with. The idea on that is maybe we shouldn't tear down the old one and spend $20 million tearing it down, but instead consider how we can preserve it and use it as some sort of tool, park space like, or anything under the sun. Those are the sorts of things that we are trying to work on now. And so that's really, I think, a good area of focus for us.
Our next question comes from George Baggett. George?
Yes, sir. First off, I'd like to welcome you to Coleman Highlands. Secondly, what do you think the chances are of our local community having any impact on the choosing a police chief and the Board of Police Commissioners?
There's a question in the comments about that too. And the question that relates to that was, do you think that there's a judicial remedy to the Board of Police Commissioners issue? I think the answer is yes. I think that to the extent we ever get local control, it will come through litigation and the courts. I wish it didn't have to be that way. I see this going in a path somewhat similar to the court-ordered desegregation litigation that we saw in the Kansas City schools for decades. But I do not think that our current colonial system and construct is something that is constitutional. I do not believe that singling out one city in the state of Missouri, one city that has disproportionate influence for people of color and others, and saying that they are less prepared, ready, capable of running a police department than any other city in Missouri is something that is appropriate and that is constitutional long term. It will be tough sledding, particularly with the constitution of our United States Supreme Court now, which is less friendly, I think, to any claim that's based on race and disparities. But it is something that I think is important for us. So that aside, the police board will be picking a new police chief. And in connection with that new police chief, it will be important for us to make sure as a board, and while I'm one vote, I get to be one loud vote who can get in the press all the time. And I know that right now the board is talking about what does public engagement look like. To me, public engagement will include a few different things. One, true community forums, where first we hear from the public about what they'd like to see improved in the police department. I think the next is to make sure that the candidates, not unlike the city manager process you saw us use, do true public interviewing. They actually are part of a broader discussion, and that indeed some of the questions that we're seeing in the comments, such as history of how we've handled different race relations issues, how do they handle press communications, how do you actually become a member of the public, are the sorts of things that are going to be incredibly important for us. And so that is much of the work that I think is vital for us. And so I do think there's going to be a role for the public. I hope it is a robust role, and I will fight as hard as I can through the Board of Police Commissioners to make sure I can ensure that that happens.
I'm going to pull one question out of the chat here since I don't see anybody's hand up, but a lot of people are asking questions in the chat. Alina Hart asked, what are the plans to improve mental health programs for our city? I recently read how Missouri ranks near the bottom of mental health services in the country. Mayor?
Yeah, it's awful right now, actually, and we have continued to see a de-emphasis and a defunding of mental health resources in the state of Missouri. In Kansas City, we have an opportunity right now, one that's somewhat unique. We recently received 50, or are soon to receive, $15 million in a settlement from pharmaceutical companies relating to opioid litigation. With that funding, I'd like to see us invest in, and will propose us investing in, a behavioral health center, the types of which actually aren't novel. They exist in places like Springfield, Missouri, and any other number of places, so that we can actually, one, make sure that there are opportunities for folks who are going through a current mental health or substance abuse crisis to have a space where they can both detox, but also receive counseling long term. I would like to see us use those opportunities far more than we're resorting to using jail facilities as our answer on mental health solutions. It is a travesty that in Kansas City right now, typically you either are taken to the Jackson County Jail or the Truman Medical Center emergency room if you find yourself in a mental health crisis on our streets. I do think funding there will help us. That, of course, is a one-off, something that I hope the state brings back at a certain point, and we continue to lobby for, is a mental health triage center. We have one right now at 12th and Prospect. We need to make sure that there's sustained funding to support it. And so that's the type of work that I think will come. But, we will have the health levy on the ballot for this spring. The health levy helps support many of our safety net hospitals and institutions, including Truman, Samuel Rogers, Swope Health Services. Swope, Rogers, and others have actually invested in good mental health support. We'll continue to try to make sure we're doing that. But I think, look, we will continue to have an issue with having more volume than this city can handle.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question of my own, Mayor, and that takes us back to the housing discussion that we've already had. And you've outlined a number of excellent steps the city has been taking over the past couple of years in the housing area. A couple of months ago, the Kansas City Star highlighted the land grab issue, where our very substantial existing affordable housing stock, a $2 billion roughly property value, is very quickly being financialized through Wall Street purchasers, investments buying large blocks of low-income housing at fire sale prices. This is, in my opinion, a very serious long-term threat to any effort to try to provide adequate affordable housing. What steps do you think the city can do to deal with this land grab issue?
A few things that have been vetted so far, and my staff continues to work on it. Different types of either land use policies or taxation policies within the bounds of the Missouri Constitution, which will allow us to frustrate investors' abilities perhaps to not just conduct a land grab, but then to sit on them for some lengthy amount of time. We have seen substantial speculation in some corridors, even along the Troost corridor, where there's been good activity in recent years, but you continue to have holdouts. I think particularly in the 30s, between 31st and 39th Street, you can see that sort of activity where folks are uninterested in doing anything. One activity that's been discussed in other areas, this doesn't necessarily relate to houses alone, but a vacant land tax or even a vacant property tax. It would have to be approved by the voters of Kansas City, but something that creates some incentive to getting folks to actually move, transfer their property, or to take some action to get it utilized again. That's one step. You have seen a few attempts through the state legislature to try to make more fundamental change as well. I think another requirement that you can put on the front end relates to how are we actually ensuring that rental regulation is actually enforced, is followed up on, and we make sure that there's a stronger voice for tenants. There was a string of pieces actually this morning. There were a string of pieces in the Kansas City Star about the KC Tenants Organization and different tenants' rights issues. Notwithstanding what groups are engaged, I think part of the reason you're seeing action at City Hall, it's not just because we're bullied, it is because we see a substantial need for the rights of tenants to be able to actually look to how we can improve our property long term. We had an imbalance in Kansas City for a number of years. I'd argue there's an imbalance around the country in terms of the rights of the landlord superseding those of the tenant And so even where there are violations of things like the implied warranty of habitability, and where we see a continued decay of housing stock in Kansas City, our hope is that through tenants' efforts, healthy home inspection efforts, and others, you see necessary improvements to our housing stock. And indeed, the city government is helping fund them in some situations, so that you see those types of improvements, which then creates greater value in the property, and which then actually encourages, we hope, right, more local owners and purchasers and those types of out-of-state speculative interests to not actually want to be engaged with the regulatory state, the taxation concerns, and others. We don't want to be a community where we're dealing with that which we are right now in the Ruskin Heights neighborhood, where there is a shopping center where the owner has just basically abandoned it. It's become a huge dumping ground, and they have the money to pay a few $1,000s a year in fines. And they just say, we're all good with it. We need to make sure that we're ramping up our enforcement efforts, our ability to take some of these landlords to court, increasing taxation on the properties, and making sure there's a consistent reminder that Kansas City is actually interested in making sure that its property is taken to its highest and best use.
All right, thank you. And we have one final question. I see your time is just about up with us. So Joe Robertson will ask the last question. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody that next Sunday, the forum will feature Craig Aaron, who will talk about the future of the media. Joe, your last question.
Yeah, Mayor, my question was, you mentioned the Kansas City Public Schools and their success recently. What's your role, the council's role going forward, as far as furthering the education in the city, particularly when you're looking at the struggle between the development tax breaks and the financial health of schools?
You know, that's certainly something that's been discussed a lot. I would say to the many who have concerns with our incentive activity, the change that we have made in the 6.5 years that I've been in public office is nothing short of incredible. I, for one, started on council, and you may recall I introduced an ordinance to reduce the level of incentives from 100% property tax breaks just to 75%. And I got calls and howls and screams from the development community saying that you have destroyed all of our opportunity, you've killed progress, you've killed momentum, and that there's nothing but malaise in the development industry. I think that that was false. I continue to see development, and in more situations, development without resorting to incentives. In terms of how we work with the school district, there are a few different ways. One, I think, is just the natural relationships you have with them. I visit with the superintendent of schools roughly once a month. I hope to continue to do that on incentives themselves and other economic development. I think having the school play a role in both discussing the judicious nature of them or not, and also having some role in getting a payment from them earlier. Payments in lieu of taxes are key to good projects. And so I would hope that we continue to see that there is that better collaboration with school districts, not just Kansas City Public, and the city council, and how we get things done more fully. I think the flaw that we had for a generation was that we basically said, who cares if we take money from the schools, because we don't care about the schools anyway in this city. It was unfortunate. And it was the sort of thing that I think really led to much of the challenge that the school district faced. I think now it's not fair to suggest that. And yes, there are projects that we still approve with which they disagree. But I think that by and large, we are trying to make sure that there is much stronger cooperation between city council, between the school district. I'll know that there is a school board representative on almost every one of the incentive boards that I've appointed, from Port Authority to TIF, and we'll continue to try to make sure that we do that for the weeks ahead.
Mayor Lucas, thank you very much. We really appreciate you spending time with us this morning. And again, continue our tradition to have the mayor of Kansas City join us and answer our questions. We know you have to run, but again, we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you again next year.
Thank you all. I look forward to being with you, and God bless you for all the work you do in the community. Sometimes just having a good forum to share information is tough, and these days with everything else that we hear out in the noise. And so thank you for taking 45 minutes to listen to me. God bless you and have a wonderful Sunday.
Thank you again. And again, reminding everybody to join us, please, next Sunday, where Craig Aaron will talk about the future of the media. With that, we'll conclude the program and have a good Sunday.